Hello and welcome back. I'm glad to have you here again because today in this video we're going to talk a lot about evidence, right? In the previous readings, hopefully you've done them because they're going to help you understand how a lot of op-eds are laid out, almost all of them really. They always have a central claim, something that they're trying to convince you of, right? And that's going to be related to the subtopic. Right, and we asked you to write about that on the discussion board. Certainly, I'll give you feedback on that. Watch for my feedback on that assignment so that you can confirm that you've got an op-ed that will work for the upcoming paper, right? Because, of course, it's got to be authoritative enough and it has to be an opinionated piece. Anyhow, though, those readings will help you think about how op-eds are structured. But to analyze the op-ed in the initial research findings paper, you have to talk about the different types of evidence that are used so that you can determine how effectively the author has proved the claim that they're trying to make to the audience. This article I shared with you from my alma mater, the University of Pittsburgh, does a really nice job of laying this out in an extremely concise fashion, right? Because when you think about it, any claim that you make, people expect to support with reasons and hopefully evidence, right? Like if I claim to you peanut butter and jelly is the best sandwich, you would say, well, why, Professor Sanger? What about Reuben's, right? You would expect me to give you some reasons why peanut butter and jelly is the best, right? And for my reasons to be persuasive, you would expect them to have some evidence, right? Perhaps a survey that I did of, I don't know, 1,000 students and found out that they all loved peanut butter and jelly as well. Then I could use that to convince you that peanut butter and jelly is the best. I know that that is a bit of a silly example, right? But it is a helpful tool to kind of help you think about the different kinds of evidence that are out there, because I need for you, when you do the initial research findings paper and you're working on the analysis of op-ed section, in order to analyze it, it's very different than the cartoon. You have to understand, you have to be able to categorize different types of evidence so that you can see them in your op-ed. So all of these are referenced in the University of Pittsburgh article, except for the last one, and I'll explain that one to you. It's kind of a glaring omission. But I think that's because they're more focused on academic arguments, and that's something that you really typically only see in op-eds. Okay, so let's talk about specific examples. So imagine if you're in the social media group and you come across an op-ed, and the op-ed's main claim is that social media makes people, people should avoid social media because social media makes people more depressed, right? If the author talks about their own experience with social media and say, oh, well, it made me depressed, that's a specific example, right? Or if they say, well, my wife used it and she sure seems depressed. Or they say, well, a student of mine used it and they seem depressed. That's a specific example. It's only one person's experience. Most students immediately recognize the limits of the use of this type of evidence, right? It's much less compelling than statistics. As I was saying, many students typically see the limits of specific examples if an author is pointing to their own experience or to the experience of one or a few people close to them. It may be interesting to read, it may be instructive, but it's not always the strongest proof because it only describes a few people's experience. Whereas statistics often describe larger groups of people's experience, right? And so the larger the sample, the more we can generalize that, those results to other people. Of course, there's limits to that, and sometimes statistics can be used inappropriately in a misleading fashion, right? So it's not to say that statistics are the gold standard here and everything else is junk. Really, what we're doing is helping you define the use of these types of evidence. And then a lot of the paper of that part of the paper, the analysis of op-ed section, is you writing to me about how the evidence is used and whether it is used in a convincing fashion. Does it really prove the thing that the author claims that it does, right? And so when you see numbers, then you know that that must be statistics, right? And if you see someone talking about personal experience or one person's experience or one or a few outcomes, now we're just talking about specific examples. Expert testimony. You do see this in op-eds sometimes where authors will point at interviews with experts, or they will point at things that experts have found out, right? I gave you the social media example, so next we'll do like an opioid crisis example. So you may have someone who has written an op-ed about needle exchanges, right? And rather than give statistics from a study about the positive benefit of needle exchanges, they cite an expert who works at one, and then the person talks about how that intervention purportedly helps addicts eventually get clean by meeting them where they are. It's a harm reduction thing, right? So expert testimony, right? So someone who is an expert in the field that the op-ed person involves in the article. Or the interesting thing about op-eds is sometimes they're written by outside experts, right? So maybe the person themselves is an expert, right? And they can talk to you about things that they've seen in that context, right? And then that's using expert testimony as evidence. Okay. Case studies you don't see in op-eds too much, but I think that it's interesting to mention because you will see these in academic journal articles. We're going to be talking more about academic journals in the weeks ahead after spring break, right? And so a case study is where a group of academics and researchers follow one person or a few people for an extended period of time, or they review a great deal of research and literature surrounding those particular, a few particular people, so that they can offer what's called a case study of that individual. Okay, last is hypothetical example. This is the weakest form of example, or form of evidence, pardon me, because it's even weaker than a specific example, right? If I'm an op-ed writer, and I don't reference statistics, and I instead tell you about something that happened to me personally, and I'm not an expert, right? Then you think, well, that's just one person's evidence. That's pretty weak. Well, a hypothetical example, that's just imaginary evidence, right? And you do unfortunately see this in op-eds quite a bit. And I think you could also kind of categorize it as wishful thinking, right? I'll give you an example. So this time we'll use an example for the plastic waste topic. So if someone might make a claim in an op-ed along the lines of, well, if we raise taxes on plastic, astronomically, this will motivate the companies that use it to find more renewable resources instead. Sounds good, but as I wrote at the top of the page here, when you see claims in an op-ed, and I hope you do this outside of just class, right? Outside of even these topics that we're talking about. When people say things on the news, I hope that you say prove it, right? Prove to me that this thing that you're talking about, this policy that you're talking about, will work the way that you claim that it will, right? Because if there's no proof, oftentimes it will be a hypothetical example. Here's another one, and this is an actual one that I read a while back. I don't know if you'll come across it if you're in the plastic waste group, but there's an op-ed out there that's about banning plastic straws, right? And the author argues that, well, if we ban plastic straws, then that's going to create a situation where people are more aware of plastic waste, and they will litter fewer other things, fewer of other plastic items as well. Okay. again, it sounds good. It sounds good, but it's imaginary, right? There's no evidence that that will happen. They're sort of promising us that that will happen, right? It's a hypothetical example, which is not to say that we shouldn't ban plastic straws, right? I'm not weighing in on that discussion. My opinion doesn't matter here, but I'm just trying to help you identify these things when you see them, right? You see these with you see these in the social media group as well. Well, if we flag content a certain way, then it will lead to better outcomes and people will have less depression when they use this site. Again, if they're not offering some evidence that that's the case, even from just a few people, right? It's it's a hypothetical example, right? I think, this is probably good, right? If you understand these concepts and you've read the readings, I think you can identify the evidence at work in your op-ed. Of course, if you feel like your op-ed has some evidence that doesn't fit into one of these categories, message me in Canvas, stop by virtual office hours, and we'll figure it out together. But I think with the readings in this discussion, you should be prepared to work on the analysis of op-ed section to answer the questions that I posed to you in the assignment directions. And of course, you're now prepared to take care of the quiz this week as well. That's all I've got. Have a good week.